I'm Justin Davis, and this is Drone Camps RC. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to build the TYRO119. This is a 6-inch quad with GPS on board, so I'm going to walk you through the steps. We're going to build up the frame, we're going to solder up the ESCs to the motors, the flight controller setup, the RX, the VTX, the GPS, everything on here. We're going to get started today. And probably the best deal out there on the internet for a 6-inch quad with GPS. So some things you're going to need, it's a good set of your favorite drivers. You're also going to need some other stuff like your TS100 soldering iron that's going to do all of your solders, and some zip ties. They come in the box as well, and you'll need some steel wool for cleaning off the soldering tool tip. Also some 3M VHB, which is super awesome stuff, a solder sucker in case you mess up, and some 60/40 solder. And personally, I use one of these smoke suckers. This is a more expensive $800 one, but you can also get a fan. This is everything out of the box. You're going to have your frame here, your hardware, your standoffs, all of your wires, a capacitor, your camera, and your GPS, your VTX, your antenna wire, and your antenna there, and the motors, as well as the ESCs and the flight controller. That's an F4 flight controller on this particular model. Now, first things first, we're going to go ahead and set up the frame and the hardware. And I like to just organize my bolts into individual piles. Make sure all your screws are the same size in each individual pile. Now on the frame, when you start to build the frame, there are two different size bolts. The shorter one goes on the outside, and we're going to start with that bottom plate shaped like an X. Keep that on the bottom of the frame. Now we're going to go ahead and grab this, what will be also a bottom plate, but just above that X plate. Looks something like that. And I'll go ahead and grab one of your lock nuts and just tighten it down by hand to start with, because we want this to move around a little bit so we can adjust the second spot here. Now the longer screw goes in the next part, and this is going to allow you enough screw to be able to put a standoff on above the thread collar nut. So we're going to go ahead, you can see there's a recessed part there. It's just drilled just a little bit bigger there so that this collar nut can go all the way down flush with the frame. You want to make sure that it's flush with the frame, and I'm going to show you how to make sure that happens. You're going to go ahead and drive it down, start working its way down. Now you can take a pair of pliers and hold it just above that collar spacer where you have enough room for it to go flush into the frame. That looks pretty close, but I'm going to have to tighten it up a little bit more. And now that looks pretty good. Now I can work on the second arm. We're going to turn that to match the other arm there on the other side. Make sure you do that. You don't want to have your arms facing all different directions. Now go ahead and grab another lock nut, and we're just going to grab the longer bolt, run that through, get one of your collar nuts here, and go ahead and spin that one down by hand. Pretty easy so far. This is one of the easier frames to build up, I think. These Tyro frames are usually pretty easy. Some of them have certain points where you might have to go back and do things again, do things twice. It always helps to pull up the Banggood website and just look at the quad before you start to build it. That always helps me with my builds. So now I'm going to go ahead and tighten down that collar. That's looking pretty good. So now we have two arms on. Now for the third arm. And you can tighten those other ones up pretty good at this point. You'll still be able to slide the arms on. Now the outside bolt first. We're just going to go ahead and hand tighten that lock nut. And now we're going to go ahead and grab one of the collars for the longer bolt there, where your flight controller is going to be put into in just a little bit. Screw that one down by hand. And now we're going to go ahead and use the pliers for seating that collar nut right there down into the frame. And again, guys, make sure it's flush. But don't over tighten these, because these will strip. These bolts are not the highest quality for $119. But they're on par with some of the other kits out there. So it's a little better quality than what I first saw with some of the Tyro series hardware. And now the last arm. And let's go ahead and work that lock nut in there. And now the longer bolt on the inside again. And the collar nut. Let's just go ahead and screw that one down by hand. And this is pretty much all there is to assembling the arms for your frame. And the next thing you want to do is just go ahead and grab a few standoffs and put those standoffs on top of those center bolts. With the first one here, and the ESC is going to start out on the bottom, and then we're going to work our way up to the flight controller. And don't over tighten these because you're screwing metal into plastic, guys. Over tighten it and you're going to strip it. I believe there was one extra standoff in this kit. Now your ESC orientation is detrimental to this build, so we want to make sure that it's facing up like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, and you'll see it labeled on the ESC. Go ahead and push that down. If it doesn't go on quad, you can kind of bend those posts a little bit. Now you want 390 Celsius on your soldering iron. That's around 700 to 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Now we're going to tin up each of these pads. Just put a good amount of solder on each one. Don't hold the iron down too long, guys, because you can have pad separation and ruin your ESCs. That's looking pretty good there. Make sure you don't burn the standoffs when you're doing that. Now we're going to tin the motor wires, because the solder that comes from China on these wires is not the best in the world. Don't rely on the solder that comes from the factory. There's a little bit of solder, but we're going to add some good stuff on there. So, and I say good stuff, it's just Amazon solder that I got. You can also get it cheaper from Banggood. I'll put a link down below for that. And pull down and away. Heat up the wire first, but don't worry about the wire order, guys. We're going to fix that later in BLHeli, motor direction. Everybody always asks which wire should I put where, and with the motor wires it doesn't matter because we have BLHeli configurator to fix that issue. If we were in a situation where we couldn't use BLHeli, the old school trick is to switch 2 wires, and it should change motor direction. Physically switch 2 wires, but we're not going to worry about that. Now we're going to go ahead and do this next one here. Motor number 2. Next we'll do motor number 3 and then motor number 4. And I usually angle the wires toward the direction of the arm, and that just, it doesn't have as much tension on the wires. And they use that plastic wire coating on these wires again to save money for this kit to make it cheaper, and I really wish they would switch to silicone. It's just much better. And don't trim these wires back too much, guys, because you'll get to a really nasty part of the wire and it's going to be harder to solder up. So that looks pretty good. Now we're going to tin up this last one, and this one it doesn't have enough trimmed back, so we're going to have to take some snips here and just wire snips and snip that off a little. We want a little better contact there to the tab. So if you have any short ones, just make sure you do that. You want a good solid connection to each tab. And make sure that you don't touch each one of these wires with any solder to the next tab over, because you will get a short and you'll burn up your ESCs. Very important. We're going to check that later with a smoke stopper, just to make sure we don't have any issues. Now, everything looks good here. We have all of our motor wires soldered up. And what you want to do next is carefully, very carefully, twist up these wires. And this wire is super, super hard to twist. Just hold it with one hand to take the tension off between the motor and the wires, so you don't pull anything off. Be really careful there. Now we're going to use blue Loctite. Shake it up first, as always. Whenever you use Loctite, you want to shake the bottle. Now just a little dab will do you. We're going to go ahead through here, and usually any metal to metal connection we're going to use Loctite on, especially on the motors. You don't really have to do it on the standoffs as much, but it's a good idea to go over your bolts every once in a while on your frame and just check them out with your driver. Make sure everything's nice and firm, not over tighten things, because you will strip it. That looks pretty good. The collar's not rubbing. Most important, that collar is not rubbing on the frame. Make sure it's centered up good. And that looks pretty good there. It's a nice tight wire. So now all 4 motors are mounted up. The ESC's on there. It's looking pretty good. They've already had the capacitors soldered onto the ESCs, which was nice. I didn't have to do that. But there are 2 holes in case yours comes not soldered up. And I got an extra capacitor in the box too. Flight controller standoffs just go above the ESC onto your existing posts. Go ahead and screw all 4 of those down. That's looking pretty good. Now we're going to solder on the battery wire. You got to make sure that you have the orientation correct here, or you will burn up your ESCs. Now we're going to tin these wires again because the solder that's on there is not much, and we just want to blob it on there. We're just going to really get a good amount of solder on these wires, and you'll see it start to bubble. And another trick to know that the wire is hot enough that's receiving is touch the solder straight to the wire instead of the iron, and it should melt when it touches the wire. Now we're going to tin the ESC tabs, and make sure that you don't overdo this for too long because they'll have pad separation from the ESC. You want a good amount. Move your soldering iron around the tab and make sure, again, you don't bridge these 2 tabs with too much solder. And the TS100 is nice because it has a nice small tip on here. Some of the stuff, the soldering irons, the cheapy deepy ones you get, the Weller ones that you get from like Home Depot, they're not that great. Try not to use those. They take forever to do a thicker gauge wire. So I'm just going to bend these over. I'm going to hold it with some pliers this time because this wire gets ultra hot. So heat up the wire first and then touch it down to the tab. That's the best way to do things when you're connecting wires to your flight controller or your ESCs. Because you don't want to heat up the tab first and have all that heat on the tab the entire time. Because again, you could get pad separation. And that will ruin your ESC or flight controller. So that looks pretty good. Now give those a tug after they're done. They should be nice and firm, and it should be nice and shiny there. Now you're going to take a zip tie, a single zip tie, and we're just going to zip tie these wires down to the frame in case the battery gets ejected. It doesn't pull directly on the ESC tabs. And that results in a lot of failures of ESCs. So now we're going to go ahead and take the ESC harness. It looks like this, pins up just like that. And we're going to plug that into the ESC there. Now we can go ahead and grab the flight controller and we're ready to go ahead and plug that in. Again, pins up. And we're just going to take your thumb and just press it down gently and tuck it underneath the flight controller there so your wires aren't sticking out. That's nice and neat. Looks pretty good. So at this point you should have a flight controller and ESC on there. Now we're going to go ahead and mount up the XM Plus and go ahead and grab your receiver wire. We're going to snip off this end right here. I'm going to make it a little bit longer in case I need to use that later. I'm going to save that wire. Usually save all your wire. Now go ahead and snip off these with your fingernails if you have any, or you can use some wire snips or whatever. Now we're going to go ahead and tin these wires, and you'll hear it referred to as RX wires. Those are receiver wires. Now it goes like this: signal, 5 volt, and ground on this particular receiver. So we're going to go ahead and do the S-bus signal wire first. It's usually a yellow or a white wire. Now if it gets too far in, scooch it back a little bit so it's directly on top of the tab, just like that. And now again, you don't want to bridge from tab to tab any solder. And if you mess up, do it over. And it doesn't take long to do your receiver wires, which is awesome. Now the final ground wire right here, that's looking pretty good. Nice and shiny. Looks good. Now on to the next step. You need to solder bridge for S-bus. On the right hand side it would be PPM, but we're using S-bus. And it looks like I-bus is over there on the right hand side. So bridge the 2 right if you want to use Fly Sky. So that didn't take a solder. It looks like a lot of solder here, guys. Go ahead and blob it up like that. And if you mess up, you can use your solder sucker. But now we have those 2 bridged. And now we can go ahead and plug in the receiver wire to the RX port. And this will allow Betaflight to see S-bus. Otherwise, it will not see S-bus when you plug that wire in. Very important. So now we're going to go ahead and add the GPS. This is simple. They made this really nice. All we have to do is plug this in. Get our BN220T there. That's a GLONASS GPS. Going to go ahead and take your GPS wire and plug it in to the port. And now the smaller end goes into the GPS itself. Looks like pins up the way I'm holding it here. And now we're plugged in and ready for some GPS. When you'll install it with this facing up. Now I'm going to put some standoffs on here again, because now we're going to mount the VTX. You have your video, 5 volt, and ground there. and it's 7 to 24 volt. That's pretty good. So you could directly mount this to your battery terminals, but we're not going to do that. We're going to go ahead and plug it into the flight controller the way it's supposed to go, because we want OSD and all that good stuff to show up. So now you're going to plug it into that port, just like that. You're going to tuck the wire underneath. You can bend these standoffs just a little bit. They'll give a little bit for you to put that VTX on there. You also have a button for changing channels on there as well. Now we're going to go ahead and take those 4 plastic nuts and screw those down to hold the VTX down. And I only put 2 on there, just saving a little bit of weight. The camera setup is just like this, guys. This wire is going to go into your camera in the back, again, pins facing up. Now the smaller side goes into this last port on the flight controller. Now your camera's installed. That was pretty easy. Make sure your orientation's right. The snail should face up, just like that. Now the main body standoffs, we're going to do the back ones first. We're going to install the camera in the front and then do this front post after we install the camera. So now just go ahead and use your driver with one of those standard size nuts, and you could use Loctite here if you want to, but I'm not going to in this particular part. And now the next post over. Pretty easy so far, right? Not bad. Now we're going to go ahead and take the VTX antenna lead with the MMCX connector and pop that in on the VTX and tuck that behind that back post right there. Now we're going to go ahead and take these collars off. Just going to remove those. And I'm not actually going to use that particular nut there on top of this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and press this through. We're going to fit this over top of the posts. It'll take some force to put that on. And now one little collar here, the lock collar, and now we're going to use the antenna and we're going to hand tighten it down, okay? You can come back with a little needle nose plier, just give it a tiny turn, but you don't want to overdo it there. So now the camera is going to be mounted up. You're going to start out with that middle hole right there. You're going to need a little tiny Phillips head screwdriver. And again, I'm not using Loctite on this because I adjust my camera quite often. Sometimes it will move, but you don't want Loctite on this. Now the second screw, this will hold it in place. And it shouldn't move. And leave them a little bit loose at this point because you might come back and adjust this later. And that'll probably be the last thing you do, is tighten up your camera screws. Okay, so that's looking good. Don't forget to take your lens cap off when you're trying to check out your video a little bit later in your build. Now it should be flush on the bottom of the frame, just like this. That's looking good there. So now we're going to put these front posts on, and I always do that after I put the camera on because it's kind of a pain to work around those posts. Got that one on, and now we should be good. Now we can work on putting on this top plate, but first we're going to do a smoke stopper. Now you go ahead and plug in this part to the quad here, and then you plug in the battery to this other part. If you have any weird things going on, you should see a light. It'll light up momentarily, possibly when you plug it in, just like that a little bit, but it won't stay on. So now it looks like I'm good to plug in the battery, and now we're going to do a check here to see that we have lights on everything, and it looks like we do. You also want to see a light on the flight controller underneath. Now to bind up your XM Plus, pretty simple. Just set it to D16, 8 channels here, and we're going to not do range. We're going to go to bind here, and you're going to press the bind button on your radio, and you'll hear your radio beep. Hold down that gold button with a driver, and you're going to plug in a battery, and you should see a red flashing light and a solid green light if you get a bind. So now unplug everything, plug it back in. And if it's too close to the radio, sometimes you'll see a red light, but ours is solid green, so I know I have a good bind. Now we're going to go ahead and mount the receiver. So I'm just putting a little zip tie around this extra bit of wire here just to tidy things up, and I'm going to zip tie that to the side of the frame as well to make sure that that wire doesn't kind of get out into the props. Go ahead and put a piece of VHB on bottom of your receiver and put it on top of the VTX there. Run your wires underneath the motor wires on the back of the quad and have them facing out like that. Now we're going to take a zip tie and we're going to get it started. We're going to go around this motor right here and down the arm. You can put it over top of the motor wire, that's fine. Just don't put it over top of your receiver wire, because we're going to take that receiver antenna and we're going to run that out on top of the zip tie, and we're going to trim this off to about the end of the antenna. Make sure you don't snip off the end of your antenna when you're doing that. Now we're going to do the other side, same treatment. Just like that. We're going to snip that off. That's looking pretty good. That's about the right length. Now we're going to take some heat shrink. We're going to trim that off, just kind of eyeing it there to see that we have it the same length. You're going to put that over the end, and it should be nice and snug all the way down to the base of the zip tie there. Now you're going to take your heat gun, or you can use your soldering iron in a pinch, or a cigarette lighter. And that looks pretty good on that side. Now we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Go ahead and run your heat shrink down to the base of the zip tie. Looking good. Now that pretty much sums up our RX installation. Now we're going to do the top plate assembly. It's 4 bolts to release the top plate, which I love. That's a nice trend that happened in 2019, 2018. Just makes it a lot easier to access your stack. Now this is a little bit tricky there. You want to make sure those 2 camera standoffs are flush with the top of that frame and that they're seated properly. And we're going to go ahead and tighten down these 4 bolts. Looking good. And now we're ready to put the GPS on. Now, what I'm going to recommend for your GPS installation is that you put it somewhere on top of this top plate, not on the arm. Don't do it on the arm. There's too much interference out here near the motors. That's not a good place to put a GPS. You want to have the GPS well above any of the RF coming from your motors or the flight stack. So generally what I do, the best way to set up is on a stack, but since I don't have a post, I'm just going to mount it to the top of the quad in the rear of the quad. Now we're going to run this GPS wire up through here. Go ahead and give it a few twists to tidy up the wire. And here we go, pins up. Go ahead and plug that in just like that. And now we're going to take a piece of VHB and put on the bottom of that and just mount it right there. And again, don't mount it on the arms. Now trim your VHB so it's nice and tidy on the bottom of that. GPS right there. You can take a razor blade and just peel back this bottom part there and just put it right there. And go ahead and give it an extra push down. Make sure it's nice and tight. That will not come off. You don't need to put a zip tie on top of this. So you're just about done. So let's go ahead into Betaflight now, and we can go through the Betaflight setup for the 119. It's not too hard. We're going to talk about the GPS as well in here. Now go ahead and plug in your USB to the flight controller. Go ahead and click on Expert tab there. We're going to start out in the ports. But first, let's go ahead and check orientation, left, right, forward, and back. If you have this wrong, you have your flight controller on sideways, which is not good. But you can reverse it in the configuration. If you need to turn it, you can do that. Go ahead and calibrate your accelerometer if it's flat. Now GPS is on UART number 1. That is pretty standard default for most GPSs on flight controllers. You've got your S-Bus is on UART 2 for your receiver. That should be checked like that. Now we're going to go ahead and go down to configuration. You can see it's right turn rear prop setup. This is how you check the prop setup on each of your flight controllers. Now all that looks good, but I think I'm going to turn these numbers up a little bit here, and you guys can go along with this one. Make this full screen so you can see it, about 4.5 for the motor idle. They had that a little bit low, I think. If that's too high, you can always go back and change it. Now we're going to click off magnometer. We're going to leave barometer on. Oh, that looks good. 180 arm angle. That'll let you arm it if you get stuck in a tree. Now we're going to type in for the craft name, TYRO119 there. That'll show up in the OSD a little bit later. We can turn that on. S-Bus and SpecSat there. That's good for your RX. Looks good. GPS is going to be U-blocks configured. Make sure GPS is turned on. U-blocks is selected here. And all that looks good. And over in the other features, all of this we're going to leave the same. Everything looks good there. And down here we're going to leave RX lost and RX set checked because we're going to use some D-shot beeper. Doesn't have a physical beeper on there, so now save and reboot. Now we're going to check out the power and battery, and I'm just going to crank this down to about 3.1. Go ahead and turn those down. After you're done with that, go ahead and click save at the bottom right. Looks good. So now fail safe. We're going to change this. Traditionally we'd use drop, but we're going to change it to GPS rescue because we're going to have GPS rescue on a switch. In a total failure, we would also want to have GPS take over and do a return to home. So this is your kind of your fail safe. If you're using this for long range, this is the way to set this up. You don't want it to drop to the ground. If you're on a long range mission, you want it to come up to a certain height and come back to you. And you can increase your return height if you'd like to, depending on where you're flying at. If you have a lot of high buildings or trees. And all this looks good over here. Now we're going to go ahead and save and reboot. And now for the PID configuration, once we go back in, the PID tuning, we're going to leave it all stock because Betaflight is doing a pretty good job these days with some of the default tuning. Now here in your receiver tab, you don't see anything moving here yet, and you won't. You need to plug in a battery. And once you plug in a battery, you're going to see that things might not line up with your Tyrannus radio. You're going to see things that are a little bit out of whack, and you see the quad spinning around there. You shouldn't be doing that. Everything is out of whack. So we're going to change this. Change it to FR Sky there. AETR. Looks good. Now we're going to click save and watch that. They magically go into line there. They're all in sync now. Throttle's good. Roll. Pitch. All of that looks good. Now my switches. And you need to activate switches in your radio, in your mixer and input tabs. Make sure that you do that so that you have some switches available. You'll need about 3 switches for this particular quad. And I'm going to put my beeper and my GPS return to home on one switch. We're going to start out with the arm tab there, and you can move these sliders around by grabbing them in the middle or on the ends like that. I usually like to tidy them up. Now aux2 is going to be for angle. We're going to save that. And now when you move your switch on your radio, you should see that gold tab move around. Now outside of angle mode, in that gray space would be acro mode. For guys that don't know that. If you're looking for acro mode, there is no tab for acro mode. So now GPS, we're going to have that on aux3, and that's my GPS spot. So I'm going to put that on the very last section there. And spot number 2, switch number, position number 2, I'm going to have beeper. So GPS rescue and the beeper are going to be on the same switch. So if you crash close in, you can use your beeper, and all the way out would be GPS rescue, failsafe. That looks pretty good there. Oh, I gotta switch that back to aux1. Make sure your arm switch is on aux1. And you can go back to the modes tab to check to see which aux is on which switch. Tongue-tied there for a second. So that looks good. Save that. Awesome. And that again is acro, by the way. Gray space is pure acro. That is on angle. You can also add horizon on there if you want to, but I usually don't use horizon. So I'm going to save that. And that looks good there. So now we're going to go down to GPS tab. You're going to test this outside. If you don't see any numbers flying through here, guys, you don't have any GPS packets coming in, and that's going to be a problem. So you have to troubleshoot your GPS, why you're not getting connection. It could be in the configuration. Motor stop or the motor test tab. You can test individual motor direction here. I usually take a piece of painter's tape, make a little flag on the top of the motor, and you want right turn rear, and you can refer to that schematic up at the top left there to change your motor direction. Don't put the props on during that. So now we're going to go down to OSD, and we're going to add some things here. I'm going to take off the warnings because I usually don't like that on there. It kind of beeps at me or tells me things I don't want to hear. Now we can add some other things, and so the most important thing is put your GPS up top, and distance from home. You want the home arrow up at the top of the screen usually. You also want latitude and longitude. So you can, if you have a complete crash and you lose your quad, you could always refer back to your DVR. So every single flight you want to be recording, because if you crash and you don't know where it went, you've got latitude and longitude right on the last point of your DVR, and you can enter that into your phone and go back and find your quad. So now we got the craft name, down there right in the center. That looks pretty good. And you can go crazy with this type of setup. There's a lot of information that you can add on the screen. We're going to do some crosshairs there. I kind of like crosshairs on my long distance quads. And now we want the compass heading up top. I like that just above the home point arrow. And guys, when you're loading this up on the ground, give it about a minute to load up the GPS home point. And once your home point loads up, move your quad around and you'll see that home arrow start to spin around. If it doesn't work or spin around at first, you probably don't have a home lock. So now we're going to use our modes tab there, and below that we're going to use timer 2. Now we want our battery voltage down at the bottom left. We also want throttle as well, because when I'm flying long range, I want the lowest amount of throttle to keep it heading. And that looks pretty good there. And don't forget to click save when you're done with your OSD setup. Looking pretty good. Awesome. So now we're going to go down to the CLI, and you can type in version to see which version of the flight controller you have if you had to do some type of reflashing of your flight controller. And now to get all the settings from this video, I'm going to type in DUMP, which is dump, and it gives me all the settings here. And I'm going to save this down to a file for you guys. I'm going to put this on Google Docs. I'm going to put that in the description in the video link down below. You guys can click on that and you can add these into your TYRO119 if you want to. And that will be available for everybody. So TYRO119 right there, DUMP. Going to save that for you. And that should help you out. If you have a situation where you have to redo this, you can use that file. So now you need to check motor direction, and at this point everything should be good in Betaflight. Now you have to close Betaflight for BLHeli to work. Make sure you close Betaflight. And you need to plug in a battery at this point as well. You usually want to do props off. And once you have the USB port plugged in, you'll see that USB loads up in this tab right here. Now go ahead and connect and click on this button here, and it will take you inside your ESC setup. You can reverse your motors here, and I had ESC number 1 needed to be reversed for motor direction on my first motor, and motor number 4, which is going to be ESC number 4. We're going to click reversed. Now you're going to say right setup. Click on that, and you'll see this prompt up at the top left. Start to go through the process of writing down to each ESC. When it says done, you should be good. Now click disconnect, and you'll hear the quad reset at this point. And now you can close BLHeli because you're just about ready to do your flight test. And another tip, guys, you're going to install the props, but once you get your props on and you do your first flight test, you want to make sure you do that line of sight, not FPV. Now the leading edge of your right turn rear prop should look like this. Leading edge is facing the direction the prop's going to turn. So directly across from that, diagonally across, is also a right turn prop. We'll go ahead and put those nuts down by hand. Now left turn is motor number 2. Put that self-tightening nut on top of that, self-locking nut, and you're going to use a wrench to tighten these down. And I don't have the GPS wired up here, or you don't see it installed, but this step got a little bit out of order, but we're all done now, and you can go fly. Enjoy, guys.